is our new Connect and Learn group on the AIE page. I will drop a link in the chat for this as well. But if you go to our groups page, you'll see that right here. And you can join. I created a Q&A for this session. So you can see Annie here already posted a question, which I'll share with you, Bob, after your presentation. But for people who aren't able to get their questions in by the end of the session, feel free to join the discussion. And, you can share your own insights, comments about your own experiences with birds on gear. But just wanted to make sure people knew about that resource and that it was available. And through this group, you'll also be able to access the recording of this session on the course page here. But with that, I will hand it over to Bob. And yeah, Bob, thanks again for presenting on this. I know at all the conferences that I've been to, Birds on Gear has been a very popular topic. And so I thought that your article in the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association newsletter was very timely, and happy to use our platform to keep that conversation going. So take it away whenever you're ready.
So while I'm trying to share my screen, Joe, I'm going to leave it up to you. If somebody's got a question in chat that you think is pertinent, just go ahead and interrupt me.
Sure.
Then waiting till the end.
Sure, I will
open to that. I'll trust you to moderate exactly
Absolutely
what sort of questions come up. So I'm Bob Rheault. I'm the executive director of the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association, representing growers from Maine to Texas, about 2,500 farms, collectively producing about $195 million worth of sustainably farmed, mostly oysters and clams, but many other species in the mix. And one of the things that, as Joe mentioned, let me see if I can get
out on the farm.
Sorry.
Hey, Brian, sorry. Could you go on mute? Unless you had a question.
Nope, sorry about that.
You're all good.
Hi, Brian. So we have held 2 sessions at the National Shell Fisheries Association's annual meetings on bird shit and the effect on aquaculture. Joe asked me to talk a little bit more broadly. I'm going to be talking mostly about shellfish, but Joe asked me to reflect on finfish a little bit, something I know very little about, but have done some recent research so that I can try and sound like I know what I'm talking about. If you've got a question, please do put it in the chat, and Joe will try and interrupt me. And I'm going to blast right through this. Here we go. First of all, on our website, I have posted a wealth of information about gear. We've got a PowerPoint video that I did recently. So if you want to get this talk in a condensed format, about 14 minutes instead of Joe's asked me to blather on for 45. Some studies done about the spatial distribution and abundance of water birds, notes from the last 2 NSA meetings, different methods of deterring birds, studies on those, some fascinating technical reports and scientific papers. And I want to especially draw your attention to this EPA technical support materials, which I'll be talking about later, but it is a fantastic document, very timely, just came out in April. It's several hundred pages long. It's not light reading, but it is solid gold, and I'll get into why. So it was right around the time when I sold my farm that floating gear became a big thing. And we have found that it reduces mortalities in many cases by half. It often produces a wonderful shaped product. It sometimes can facilitate some of the management issues of killing off the fouling and producing a crop and And obviously it comes with its own set of challenges. You can't just go water skiing right through it. A lot of waterfront homeowners object to looking at it. And of course, birds like to roost on it. And when they leave something behind. And that has been a challenge. So in the interim, here's some data that I borrowed from Deb Barnes in New York. I think it's great. Yeah, it says right there, Great South Bay. And so somebody's talking, but
Hey, sorry, Jason, could you go on mute? We're able to hear you.
that's okay. So some of the samples, I guess, gathered that this site was near a waterfowl roosting site, or maybe it was a sanctuary or something, but there were a lot of birds involved. And Deb saw the birds on the gear and the gear coated with guano and had her staff go out and do some sampling. And some of the sampling was eye-popping, and highlighted in red here are the numbers that exceed limits. And we don't use oyster meat numbers anymore in the ISSC, but it was something we used to do. Instead, we use water. But still, some of the water samples were above the limits for the indicator bacteria, fecal coliform. Now, and these are absolutely disgusting levels of fecal coliform levels in the meats. One thing that I would note is that these guys were selling oysters, and I'm not aware of any illnesses, but nonetheless, this was eye-popping and and created some challenges. When we did our rewrite of the aquaculture chapter of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program in, I think it was 2015, the FDA mandated that each site, that we insert this language into the aquaculture chapter, that each aquaculture site that may attract sufficient birds or mammals that their waste presents a human health risk shall have a written operational plan. And it was pretty vague. It didn't really say very much more than that about what the operational plan should do and how we should mitigate the birds. But it became apparent that we can't have this. A, it's a bad look, and B, it's a health risk. Now we're still wrestling with how much of a health risk. Your operational plan shall include a description of the mitigation to deterrent measures to minimize the potential pollution impact of the birds or mammals. And it was, again, quite a broad statement, allowing each of the states to interpret it as they saw fit. And then in 2021, we had an illness outbreak in a very shallow pond with a very low tidal amplitude, and 8 people ended up in the hospital. It was very notable. A couple things that fecal coliform levels were non-detect about 75 feet from the farm. I think there were 3. Just a couple days before these people landed in the hospital. They were closed for several weeks, and then the grower decided some of the numbers that were sampled from the farm showed Campylobacter species. Oddly, one thing that was really hard to understand was the Campylobacter species detected in the environmental samples in the oysters it turned out to be a different species of Campylobacter. There's 3 or 4 different species of Campylobacter that can be pathogenic to humans. Then were detected clinically from the sick people's stool. So that was odd, but nonetheless, it was pretty clear that it was totally clear that the cormorants attracted to the floating gear were related to the illnesses at the restaurant. So the grower sank his gear, and the birds dispersed, and a few days later, the waters tested clean, and then they extended the closure for 2 more weeks to allow them to clean out. But nonetheless, this really attracted a lot of scrutiny from the FDA, notably, and from a lot of the state authorities, and justifiably. No one wants to have people getting sick from shellfish. It's bad for sales, bad for everything. but it generated a wide array of responses from the various state authorities. Some of the state authorities sort of are looking at this like, well, we've got 10-foot tides, we're not really worried about it. And some of them are extremely restrictive and going right into the middle of the array of floating gear, looking for fecal coliform counts and threatening to close down farms that are not putting up enough deterrence, forcing people to sink their gear for as long as 3 weeks following potential guano exposure. So, just a huge array of responses from the various states because they have broad authority and very little guidance. So, okay, I just said all this. So, yeah. So, as I said, some states are viewing the risk as small and view it as their right or duty to conduct what they believe is a risk analysis and have decided that this is an acceptable risk and really are not requiring their growers to do much at all. And some growers, some states are going in quite the different direction. And then last year at the ISSC, the Aquaculture Committee, submitted 12 pages of guidance to sort of clarify what the authority could consider doing. It's not regulatory language, it's guidance and what the authority can consider doing. Consider flushing and hydrodynamics, consider bird seasonality. Up here in New England, we have typically got about 2.5 months of bird presence, cormorants in July and August, and maybe a little bit of September, and then the tern migration comes through, and most of the rest of the year, we don't have a whole lot of birds on our gear. But I understand down south, the pelicans just live there, and they're on the gear all year long, which poses another challenge. Considering nursery gear differently from gear that is holding stuff that is going to be eaten by humans. Consider resubmergence requirements to allow the shellfish to cleanse out after exposure. Unfortunately, the FDA has not yet adopted these revisions to the NSSP. And, it's a challenge to edit, I guess, 500 pages of regulatory material. But I would have hoped they could have gotten it done in a year, but we're still waiting for them to release the revised NSSP, which has this aquaculture guidance in it. So the other thing is that it's very clear that guano can impact water quality. And right now, under our rules, we are mandated to close waters when the fecal coliform levels exceed the arithmetic mean limits over 30 samples in 30 years. And so, if you get 3 bad samples, it's likely that you are going to have to close a harvest area. So, that's just written in ink in the NSSP, and our authorities don't have a lot of choices there. And so that poses a big risk. So for that reason alone, we need to be deterring the birds from being near our farms. There is some question as to whether you want to go into the middle of that array to go sample, or whether you should use the sampling stations that you used to have. And then there's also the question about, what about birds on non-farm growing areas? Are we sampling for those as well? It's pretty frequent that when I'm visiting friends on the Cape, I'll see a nice boil of bait and we'll see hundreds of birds in the water, and they're all leaving something behind as well. But it's not uncommon to see a recreational or commercial fisherman go out and harvest clams off that sandbar a few minutes later. So, I don't know. We do know that these are well-known facts, that the correlation between coliforms and pathogens is well established for wastewater. But we also know that human pathogens is very rare in wildlife, and that the correlation between human pathogens in wildlife feces is largely unknown, but we do know that it's a non-zero risk. So, one might consider that we need to all of these, all of these regulations about closing harvest areas have been based on the correlation of human pathogens in human wastewater. If we know that there's no human influence in these waters, should we be thinking about them differently? I'm going to get into that. So, obviously we need to close growing areas if the numbers require it. That's just, we don't have a lot of latitude there.
Hey, Bob,
The food
I'm
code
actually
also,
sorry. I actually have a question just before you
good,
get
yeah,
too far
fire
in
away.
this slide. Deborah was asking if there's a link to the 12-page recommendations that you mentioned.
Well, I was really hoping that the NSSP would be published. We can certainly get it out of the the minutes of the Aquaculture Subcommittee of the ISSC. I have it on my hard drive. I have not posted it,
Okay,
but I'd be happy to send it to you, Deb.
sounds good. Thanks.
Remind me. Um, so the food code also dictates that it's illegal to have filth, waste, or fecal material in food. And the FDA and SSP, does recognize that a small amount of fecal coliform in shellfish is permissible. And the problem is that we really lack the tools to properly evaluate the risk of illness. So, deterring these birds. Well, it's tricky. They're smarter. I always just think, bird brain, right? Well, they're actually smarter than we think. They tend to acclimate or habituate to various different deterrents. What we find is that you probably will need multiple approaches and to rotate the different approaches as the birds acclimate to whatever you are putting on your gear to keep them away. What we do find is that many of approaches are interfering with the maintenance of the gear or worker safety or are creating marine debris. We are still searching for the ideal solutions. I'm going to go over some of the solutions that have been found. Most of these are from work done by Josh Reitzma on the Cape. So scare kites, these kites are effective in many areas. Certainly, I've got reports of many growers that say they work. You do have to move them around occasionally. The birds will acclimate if you don't move them from one site to another. They come with a heavy weight and an anchor, so you can move them around. They do get shredded in a high wind, so you need to take them down. And then they're not great if there's no wind, there's nothing happening. And sometimes we're even prohibited from using them. I've got an area in Rhode Island where a grower is prohibited from using the scare kites because it might disturb the feeding behavior of the threatened marsh swallow, which apparently can see for miles. So it's an approach to try in some areas if they'll let you. Of course, I'm getting a phone call. Some growers have found that if you put tall poles in the water and string monofilament or wire between them, the birds will be deterred. And they have very sharp eyes, so they can see this from quite some distance. This has proven effective on some land crops as well. Again, if the line snaps and ends up in the water and marine debris wrapped around your prop or garrots a nearby water skier, that's never going to be good. Perching deterrence, various number of things have been tried. You can go on birdaway.com and buy these bird spikes. They seem to be quite effective. This is something that Ketchum has tried, folding up some wire. Ketchum is working on a string that goes, we got a bunch of growers trying it out. I think that this is going to be quite effective and quite affordable. The question is when you flip it, does it get fouled with eelgrass? Does it interfere with flipping gear or maintaining the gear or hauling the gear? These are all things that are concerns. Zip tie ticklers have been tried with mixed results. Typically, you need to have a lot of them or the birds just sit between them. Sometimes they'll sag and they'll collect fouling and debris. The terns especially will sit right between them. Cormorants don't like them. They don't like, if you get enough of them, it can be effective, but it's not cheap. And then you get these floating bags, and I'm really quite flummoxed as to how we're going to keep the birds off these floating bags. It makes a perfect raft for these floating shit bags. Other mechanisms in development. I'm talking to this guy about green lasers, who seems to think that they work on for about 4 acres of farmland, keeping them birds, starlings from eating corn and things like that. They are expensive. He wants to work with us and try and see if we can get it. They don't hurt the birds. They don't blind the birds. They don't burn the birds. They just startle them. They think they see motion and they fly away. Sprinklers, drones don't really work very well. Farm activity, for the larger farms, talking to Bill Mook up in Maine, they've got such a huge farm. They're always out there, and that keeps the birds away. But there's a neighboring farm that is a smaller farm, and they may only go out there once a week or every other week, and the birds are hanging out all the time. I've got a grower in New Jersey who's got an animatronic coyote mounted on a float that he says works. Some people are experimenting with bird distress calls. I think we need a lot more experimentation. So one question is, so how much effort and cost is justified? How much of a risk of illness do we really have? So, one Campylobacter outbreak in 3 years, that might be a coincidence. 2 would be a coincidence, and 3 would be a trend. But we've had 1, so I am starting to think that this is a rarity. And when I look on social media with all of the floats covered with guano, I would think we should be stacking up people like cordwood, and it's just not happening. And by the way, stop posting pictures of guano covered floats on social media. It's a bad look, honestly. Um, so, I think that if regulators go looking for the indicator bacteria, in other words, if they go right into the middle of a field, they will probably find it. But I think they should also be looking in wild harvest growing waters. Right now, I've got many shellfish authorities are sort of saying, well, the tide's carrying it away. We're not seeing illnesses. I don't think that this is such a great risk. And, there's a lot of science that is suggesting this. This is an article from 2020 that was done, I believe, by FDA people looking at crops, land crops, and worried about birds pooping on vegetables, raw vegetables. And their data, they concluded that we do not have enough information to determine the likelihood of enteric pathogen spillover from wild birds to humans. So, and I've been doing a deep dive on the literature. It's pretty clear that, like, Campylobacter is one of the big ones. Campylobacter hates oxygen. It hates UV light. It doesn't survive long in seawater. And so, and it's likely to be spit out by the oysters pretty fast. Most of the science that we've done in depuration plants shows that bacteria are purged in 48 hours. And there's decades and decades of depuration studies looking at purge rates of bacteria. One of the nice things that I've learned recently is that birds do not spread human enteric viruses, which do tend to last a little bit longer. And so that's a big relief, because norovirus can take several weeks to purge. Campylobacter are highly host adapted. This study showed that only 1 of 109 Campylobacter isolates from wild ducks is associated with human disease. That, it makes sense that these pathogens are highly species specific. Again, it's a non-zero risk, but if wild bird isolates are only accounting for a very small fraction of human infections. I mean, we do know, for instance, the Campylobacter is causing a lot of people to get sick from workers in chicken houses. Chickens hold a lot of human pathogenic strains of Campylobacter. Thankfully, gulls and apparently seabirds do not. So we do know that the birds are negatively impacting water quality and can contaminate the shellfish. But it is pretty clear that even these smart scientists are considering this to be less of a risk of human illness than other sources of fecal contamination, especially that of humans. So we believe that the risk is, or at least I should just say because the outbreaks are rare. We acknowledge that the risk is non-zero, but what is an acceptable level of risk? It appears to be much lower than some of the other pathogens we see pretty regularly showing up in shellfish illnesses. And what controls are justified and under what conditions? And are similar controls being mandated for the wild harvest when birds are present in growing areas? Or is aquaculture being just singled out because the floats are so because we have them black? Maybe we should have white floats. When I look around at a lot of wild harvest areas, I see a lot of white covered rocks. So the ISSC at the April XCOM meeting, we formed a guano abatement committee, and we're charged to review the literature, look for seasonal and spatial data, evaluate methodologies for a quantitative risk assessment, evaluate purge rates for pathogens, and then hold a workshop on the findings, hopefully by this fall. And then shortly after that, this April, is someone trying to get me? This April, the EPA, right after we had that XCOM meeting, the EPA came out with this technical support document, and it's primarily for bathing waters and recreational bathing waters, but it's a fantastic document. I mentioned it earlier. I've been doing a deep dive on this, and it is worth its weight in gold because it has done an extensive, comprehensive literature review. It looks at how we should be classifying bathing waters that have been impacted by either livestock or birds or dog waste, but not human waste. And it's very clear from their work and their extensive analysis of the risk that the risk is quite different than it is for human wastewater. They give you strong recommendations on how to do an epi study that would allow you to do a risk analysis, or in cases where there's very few illnesses to work with and you can't really have enough data to make a correlation between the indicator bacteria and illnesses. It allows you to model it based on a number of different things, like how long does the pathogen survive in seawater under different conditions, and all of the various things that might impact how the pathogen persists, how it gets to the watershed, et cetera, if it's a land-based source. Now, it's a little bit different, honestly, when we're talking about shellfish growing waters and the birds are right there in front of your shellfish. But it outlines how we would be able to conduct a quantitative risk assessment and what we need to do and how to proceed. So it's done quite a bit of the work that the Guano Abatement Committee was charged to do, and for that I'm thankful. The EPA, some of the findings that they talk about is that the correlation between fecal indicator bacteria and human pathogens in Gulf feces is 2 orders of magnitude less than for seawater impacted by human waste. And I think that is right there a huge reassurance, and tells me that obviously much of what I've been saying is probably true, that birds pose less of a risk than human wastewater. But it's going to take substantial resources for us to develop the data needed to convince the regulators to change the fecal indicator bacterial standards for growing waters. I'm hoping that this EPA document will allow them to think twice about closing waters. And that was a proposal that I put in 2023, that we should be developing a different criteria for closing growing waters if we are confident that the indicator bacteria source is non-human. Obviously, that proposal failed, but I was hoping that it would fail and that we would set up a committee, and it looks like I was successful there. but I'm not naive enough to think this is going to be a quick process. This probably will take decades. I am a persistent man, however, I'm going to keep pushing this rock. So I suppose I should pause a minute and take questions because I'm about to shift gears dramatically. Should we put in the clutch? Anybody have a question about shellfish and birds?
Sure, yeah, we can pause for that. If people want to either raise their hand or put the question in the chat, I'm happy to read it. I do, Annie's question in the group page was related to shellfish, so I could pose that one to you. She was saying if you're aware of any resources or research looking at the impacts of mass bird roosting at aquaculture sites on algal populations. She said it's in response to concerns in Maine about the relationships between nutrient loading from birds and algal blooms affecting wild shellfish populations in the area.
Sure. So, this was raised in a similar fashion there was a controversy up in Maine about a proposed farm near an airport, and the opponents of the farm were suggesting that the birds would pose a risk to the airplanes. And what we tend to believe is that the bird aggregations around farms may aggregate the birds on the farm, but they probably don't aggregate the birds in the area. In other words, increase populations beyond what would be there naturally. They just might be dispersed along the shoreline. Whereas when there's a place for them to roost, like this log pictured in the middle here, they do tend to aggregate there. Now, does that aggregation locally influence the total input of nitrogen to the watershed? Probably not. If we were doing something that increased the total population, increasing prey, or doing something that caused birds to aggregate from a wider region, it's conceivable that the localization, I suppose, of the nitrogen might have an impact. But I think in the aggregate, there's little evidence to suggest that we're increasing the total population of birds through the shellfish gear. One thing that we do see in contrast is that we are drastically increasing the survival and numbers of birds by having these fish farms down south. And I'll get into that in a minute. The population of cormorants has almost doubled in the last 30 years when we figured out how to do catfish farming. But I don't believe so. So I'm gonna go with that. I don't have any data or evidence to say
Okay.
one way or the other, but I'm just trying to think of it logically.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't see any other questions at the moment, but yeah, if people do have questions during the rest of the presentation, feel free to raise your hand or drop the question in the chat, and we'll make sure that gets answered.
So I am far from an expert on fish. If it has a backbone, I find it inherently boring. But I did do some studying because Joe asked me to. So I've looked up a bunch of this and got some great information from the National Aquaculture Association. And one of the biggest challenges we have is the double-crested cormorant, one of my favorite guano depositors from my fish farming career. Populations have more than doubled over the past 30 years. Fish and Wildlife estimates that in just the 3 years between 2017 and 2020, there's been a huge increase. These are not an endangered population, but they are covered by the Migratory Bird Act. So we're not supposed to harass them without special permits. It's estimated that they eat close to $70 million worth of catfish, almost 10% of what we're growing commercially down south. And farmers are spending a huge amount of money per acre trying to scare them away from their farms using a variety of techniques that are, again, not very effective. Fish and Wildlife did establish limited take permits and depredation permits, allowing farmers to shoot some. I don't advocate that we should be doing that on shellfish farms. I think that's a bad look. But if you can prevent, scare, deter, repel, or kill the first arriving bird, it has been proven effective to prevent flocks of these cormorants from congregating on fish farms. So a lot of the farmers down south have found that just taking that first bird or preventing that first bird from landing on your pond keeps you from having to shoot a lot of birds, which is good. I'm not a big fan of killing birds, as much as I personally dislike cormorants. There's a lot of record keeping requirement. You have to document like your cost of repellents and their profits and how many you take and monthly and annual reporting and bird surveys. This is not a wonderful program, but it does save growers some fish. And it's not just cormorants and catfish. We've got 13 states that have had massive losses to predation by the double-crested cormorant, but we've also got hundreds of ponds of hybrid striped bass, redfish, baitfish, and ornamental fish. And millions of dollars of fish are being lost. And it's not just cormorants. We've got herons, egrets, pelicans, scaup, gulls, ospreys, and eagles. And many of these are protected under federal law. And now some of these ornamental fish are, quite valuable. I was told that there's it's a museum in Washington State, or maybe it's Oregon. Anyway, they've got these giant koi, and each one is worth thousands of dollars. And they have these golden eagles that swoop down and periodically take these $1,000 koi. And of course, you're not allowed to do anything to eagles, just like you're not supposed to harm most migratory birds, but eagles get a special protection. Baitfish farmers, and I was kind of shocked at how big of an industry this is. There's a lot of people raising goldfish for recreational fishers, and it's a multi-million-dollar crop down south, and many of these growers are reporting losses ranging from 8 to 59% of their crop, as well as huge losses trying to repel these birds. And then it's not just predation as well. So many bird attacks are injuring fish, leaving them rotting or dying in the fish pond, which is bad for the health of the other fish. And then there's these pathogens that a lot of these birds tend to carry from site to site. So there's parasitic trematodes that will make catfish fillets unmarketable. You've got parasitic flukes. You've got bacterial pathogens that force the growers to treat entire ponds at tremendous expense. So yeah, it's a big challenge, and no one has really got a good handle on the cost of these baitfish farms or these others. But one thing that we can say is that a number of producers, especially of ornamental fish, are moving indoors, and the cost of these indoor recirculating systems are incredibly high. So that must tell you that the cost of predation losses are even higher. And of course, this is going to depend on the system. The ponds are immense, but it does indicate that the cost to these growers is not insignificant. And we do need to do that study to document this, but nobody's going to give us permission to shoot eagles or great blue herons. So maybe going indoors is really the best thing we can do. I don't believe we can grow shellfish indoors. I hope that we can find affordable deterrents to keep most of them off of our gear. But I also believe that in some areas with high tidal flux, it's probably less of a risk than we believe, and we can probably deal with it by submerging animals for 48 hours or a week in waters away from the source of the birds. But right now, each state is dealing with it as we can. And, I would also point out that salmon farmers have had problems with bird predation, especially on smolts and smaller fish. And they're able to net their crops. But that's not something we can do. It's not something they can affordably do down south for these bait fish farms. But anyway, that's really all I got. I encourage you to check out my website for the wealth of information that we've posted, the last couple of newsletters that I've written on this, the technical document by the EPA, and I'm going to stop my share. And there's my email address. Feel free to shoot me an email, bob@ECSGA. And there we are. How did I do?
Awesome.
45 minutes. You asked me to do 45 minutes. Look at that.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, and I'm gonna drop a link in the chat to the Bob's website, the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association, if y'all wanted to check that out. I'm also going to drop a link to our exit survey for this session. That, just a few questions if y'all want to fill it out while we're doing the Q&A. It really helps us improve these virtual sessions. We want to make these as great as possible. And then finally, just before we get into questions, I'm going to drop the link again to the discussion forum on the website if you wanted to post questions there. If you're not a member of the Aquaculture Information Exchange yet, you'll be prompted to register if you follow that link. So yeah, please join. Bob's a member and he'll be there to respond to questions. But yeah, if we have any questions right now, if people want to raise their hand.
I see Sebastian is on. He can probably speak about fish more eloquently than I.
Sebastian, you want to take him up on that?
I'm not sure I can. I think Skid outlined it pretty directly. The only thing I would say is that there are, just as with fish, in the case of shellfish, there are a number of health issues that are either vertically or horizontally transmitted associated with birds. And so it's not just human health, it's also shellfish health that we're concerned about. And, one of the things that I think Skid and his group has done really well is integrated those concerns into some BMP recommendations to try to reduce the risk from a biosecurity point of view of transmission of pathogens or parasites between farms or between the wild and farms. And I think that's certainly an issue that we as farmers have to deal with as well.
I encourage everybody to go and download our free, recently updated BMPs.
Awesome. I will track down a link for that. Any other questions? We have a great turnout here. I know one of y'all probably has a question.
Any regulators on board? Anyone from the Guano Abatement Committee? Everyone's so shy.
There's a few regulators on there, Bob. They're in intelligence gathering mode, I think, at this stage.
Well, I hope they download the EPA document because I think that's solid gold. I've been postulating that the risk is lower than we think, and they come forth with solid scientific evidence that I'm right. I love that.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Skid, and I think that it's rare when you see a really thoughtful, comprehensive risk assessment approach to this kind of issue, and it's kind of ironic that EPA came up with that instead of FDA. I have to say, but it's a very comprehensive document.
Hey, Bob, would you be able to go back to that slide with the EPA document? Just so I can get the title, so I can
Yeah,
search for
so
it
I
and
mean, if
drop a
you go
link.
to my website and ecsga.org,
Hmm.
and then look at bird interactions under health, it's down there about number 8. But I
Yeah,
could
I think I
certainly
found it.
I can share it again. But yeah, the technical
No, here, I got the link.
memorandum, it is absolutely solid gold. Oh, and by the way, we're still doing a lot of work on developing deterrence. And one thing I wish I could get a grower to try is you never see a bird sitting on one of those cones that's on top of a piling. Can't we just get somebody to strap a row of those cones to their oyster grow float and see if that works? Because if that works, we can make molds that will have that same profile, and that should eliminate any perching.
Well,
I
yeah,
think it's a great idea.
on that note, I'm curious for people in the session, what have y'all tried as far as disincentivizing birds to land on your gear? I hope someone on here is using an animatronic coyote.
Scared you could take those Dixie cups that come at water fountains that are cone shaped and spray them with some resin and glue them on. That'd be cheap.
Or strap them on with a piece of monofilm. And I just want to document that it works rather before we go ahead and make a $50,000 mold. But if it works, I know that growers or that the gear manufacturers would change their molds to have a bird repellent shape, because there's a market.
What are some things that other people have tried?
I think the most important thing that Bob noted is that animals acclimate to deterrence and that you have to constantly change. That's something that the land agricultural community learned many years ago. And so, at least from our perspective, we give our growers what's called a predator deterrence plan, which is they have to map out the deterrents they're going to use, and then they rotate through them on a schedule. And that definitely is more effective than one thing that you just do. I recognize, and I think Bob's right, that physical barriers to prevent perching are really important, but deterrence, animal behavior has actually had a tremendous amount of study done on it over the years, and we can learn a lot from the agricultural folks on the land in terms of what they've used. The one other thing that Bob didn't mention that I think we've seen success with up here, although it's expensive, is we do have a local guy who manufactures movable eagle decoys that have wings that move in the wind, and they actually seem to be pretty effective, particularly on our mussel rafts. I don't know that they would work so well on smaller oyster gear because they're kind of heavy, but they do seem to work pretty well on the mussels.
Aaron in the chat was asking if there's any thought to providing alternative perching sites somewhere nearby that would be more attractive to birds.
An interesting idea. We're probably prevented from doing anything outside of our lease. And if you do it on the lease, you're interfering with the water quality on the lease. So that's probably not a great idea. I did have a maintenance raft where I did a lot of my work, and it was away from my lease. And every morning I had to spend a good 15 minutes cleaning the cormorant dreck off of it because you couldn't stand up or you'd fall down. It was just a disgusting place for them to perch. So I think there may be some value there. I think we should do some gut content analysis of a few thousand cormorants, actually.
Hmm. And what about any advice, Bob, for farmers who may be dealing with this issue, who are maybe preparing for a visit from a regulator or an inspector? How can they prepare for that?
Well, I would ask that they could talk to their regulators, and obviously you want to be friends with your regulators as much as possible. And we should have the guidance coming out very shortly. And if you're in an area with good flushing, then you can at least make the argument that the authority is allowed to consider hydrology. If you're in an area with poor flushing, low tidal amplitude, and shallow waters, you probably need to be deterring if you're putting out human food, honestly, or at least letting that product splash for a few days somewhere away from where the birds are. But and some of these are very, very challenging. I don't know how you can keep birds from roosting on the Zapco bag floating design, honestly. I see Barley done
Yeah,
his
Barley, go
hand
ahead.
up. Fire away, Barley. What do you got?
Hi, how you doing? I just figured I'd chime in because we've been fighting this battle for a few years now. The bird kites really don't seem to work. I think everybody kind of knows that. They acclimate within a matter of days. Cormorants, we found are pretty easy to deter, actually, just because they're kind of big and clumsy. And we've actually just starting last year, we incorporated some of those strings that you showed that Ketchum's working on, the strings that run the length of the floats. Those work really well for cormorants. It's the terns that are the hardest by far because they're so small and they require such a small footprint. They're the hardest to deter. I mean, I think those bird spikes would work like a charm, but they're ridiculously expensive.
Yeah, and the terns honestly have a very small deposit.
Yeah. Right.
And a very brief migratory pattern.
Yeah, no, they're here for at least a month, long enough to cause concern, but that's my 2 cents. And I'll actually, Bob, if it's all right, I'm going to give you a call after the meeting.
Yeah.
Further about this. Thanks.
Well, the design that we're working on with Ketchum, hooking onto the caps on the end floats for those floating gear modules, either the Oyster Grow or the Flow and Grow. I think that's going to be a cheap and easy solution for a lot of the birds. And if you use a bungee, I'd be curious, or a piece of monofilament even, I'd be curious if the terns would sit on that. So that's worth trying out. We're in development here. And I think that, there's a lot of smart people who are working on this. I'm confident we're going to find designs that work. Hopefully we won't have too many farms shut down in the interim.
Yeah, thanks, Barley. And I know Barley's on the Aquaculture Information Exchange. So if there's anything that you can share from your phone call with Bob, please post that on the discussion thread so everybody else can see as well.
Will do. Thanks.
Any other last minute questions? We got about 5 more minutes.
I just want to make a plug. If you're in Maine, join the Maine Aquaculture Association. Sebastian's doing a great job. The National Aquaculture Association is defending you on the national level. I'm working hard to keep the world safe for shellfish farmers at the ISSC. We all need your support. So join your associations, support them, so that we can continue to support you.
Seems to me like a good note to end on, but do we have any other last minute questions? Just checking one more time. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody for coming. We've got an exciting list of other virtual sessions with guest speakers next month, which I'll be emailing about at the end of the week. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, thank you, Bob, for speaking. This was a great talk. I will be uploading the recording to the Connect and Learn group, so keep an eye out for that. And if you do think of any other questions, you can ask those in the discussion forum. All All right. Have a good rest of your week, everybody.